My name is Quinn Janecke, but as some of you know, my real name is Joachim Janecke, the name given to me at birth. I live at Glacier Hills. I want to tell you a little bit about my life in 30 minutes for a lifetime. I have an accent, which many of you know, and there's nothing I can do about. I was born and raised in Germany. As a teenager, I lived through World War II, and some of those events are etched in my memory. I had all my education in Germany, and in the 1960s, I went with my family, my wife Christa and 2 children, to the United States. We came to Ann Arbor. I joined the physics faculty of the university. I was teaching. I was involved in research projects in nuclear physics, and I did experimental work at a large number of accelerator labs in the United States, from Brookhaven to Berkeley to Texas A&M and many more. I also worked overseas in the Netherlands and in Japan. I attended numerous international conferences. My life in 1 minute and 50 seconds. Well, let me be a little more detailed. I was born in 1929. I lived in Heidelberg, a beautiful town in the southwest corner of Germany. The first 10 years of my life, from 1929 to 1939, were very pleasant. My parents had academic background. My mother had a PhD in 1920 when she was 24, 25 years old. My father retired early, and he built a big and beautiful house. Yeah, I remember that. And actually, I visited recently. I had 3 older brothers and a sister. She was the oldest. There were 2 cousins of mine who were also part of the family, like another brother and a sister. At age 10, I became a member of the Hitler Youth, well, with sports and roaming the woods, like Boy Scouts, but a lot of indoctrination, of course. Then I remember early September 1939, when France and Great Britain declared war on Germany 2 years after the German invasion of Poland. I listened to the radio together with my parents. My parents were very quiet. They remembered World War II, and they had several sons. Air raid alarms started in 1942. This started during the day, during the night, but sometimes also during the day. School was often interrupted. Heidelberg was never bombed, but I spent many nights in the basement. Ours was a boys' school, but in 1943, in the fall, several girls entered our class. They came from Mannheim, where all schools had been closed because of the bombing and the destruction. Our class was half empty. I was 14 years at the time. Our class was half empty because all my older 16-year-old classmates had been drafted, and they were trained to operate anti-aircraft guns to shoot at Allied airplanes. They were stationed in Mannheim. At that time, 2 of my classmates had already been killed, and 3 were in the hospital. I remember that. Then in September of 1944, the following year, all 15-year-old boys, including me, were activated to work on the other side of the Rhine to dig trenches ahead of the advancing US Army. This was in the Alsace. 2 years into this time, our train was stopped at a village, at the train station in the Alsace, when another train, a military transport train, pulled up. Well, we were very unlucky, because soon 4 or 5 US fighter planes showed up and completely destroyed the military train with machine gun fire. I was scared, particularly at the end when one of the planes flew lengthwise and I could see the muzzle, what is this called? I'm terrible. The muzzle flashes. Many soldiers were killed, but only one of our 15-year-old boys was killed. He was from a village near Heidelberg. He had red hair, and mercifully, he was shot through his head. Then a friend of mine and I were ordered to escort the casket back to our hometown of Heidelberg, which we did. I came home. My mother opened the door. She cried. They had just received word that my oldest brother, a fighter pilot, had been shot down. He was the second of my 3 brothers who did not return from the war. There was no school in all of 1945. I was drafted, barely 16-year-old, into a paramilitary home guard unit called Volkssturm. This happened all over Germany. Our unit did not see any action and we had no casualties. Others did. But after the war ended in 1945, I was stranded in the south of Germany near Munich, and I couldn't go home because I needed discharge papers. I heard the rumor that if you turned yourself into an American prisoner of war camp in Dachau, north of Munich, you would be discharged the same day. I took a chance, hoping they wouldn't keep me. Well, I turned myself in, they did not keep me, and I had my discharge papers. Then I started my long way home. I started from the freight terminal in Munich on top of a freight car, but we made it only from Munich to Augsburg, and then we were all kicked off. I have no recollection how we continued. I did know that we had to avoid the French zone of the occupation because they kept all former German soldiers, it turned out, for several years. I do remember that towards the end of my journey, I was hanging on to the back of a freight car for several hours, and I returned home after several months. School started again in 1946 as if nothing had happened. About 1/4 of my classmates did not return. They were killed or missing in actions. Miraculously, a friend of mine returned from Russian captivity, was taken Russian prisoner of war. Even so, ours was a boys' school. 3 of the girls returned. A year and a half later, we graduated from high school. This included a girl by the name of Christa. We married several years later, which was the best decision I ever made in my life. She went on for an MBA, and I studied at the University of Heidelberg, ending with a PhD in physics. My PhD work was an experimental work in cosmic radiation. I used a triggered cloud chamber to observe the tracks of charged particles, like the contrails of the airplanes. I was supposed to see the decay products of a new particle. I didn't see it, and it turns out it didn't exist. But I built a huge number of Geiger counters. I saw that electronics In those years, you didn't buy electronics. You built it yourself, you sold it yourself. So I built amplifiers and coincidence units and stretchers and power supplies. Anyway, I received my PhD in 1955. My thesis chairman, Professor Bode, received the Nobel Prize just 1 year earlier, also for some earlier work in cosmic radiation. I continued to work at the Max Planck Institute, where I had done my thesis. This started my lifelong work in experimental nuclear physics with the cyclotron. The Max Planck Institute had the second cyclotron in Europe after the Joliot-Curie in Paris. I have to say a few words about cyclotrons. Cyclotrons were invented by Ernest Lawrence in California in the early 1930s. He received the Nobel Prize, of course. Here, charged particles move in circular orbits in a strong magnetic field, but they are accelerated with an alternating electric field, so they actually spiral outwards, and they are extracted all in vacuum, of course, and then hit the target. So I worked for 4 years at the Max Planck Institute. Then I received a letter from the University of Michigan. They offered me a postdoctoral position. They called it research associate for 1 year. So I came to the University of Michigan. I worked at Randall Lab and East University in the basement with a cyclotron. So I worked on nuclear reactions. Actually, I stayed, they invited me for a second year. Then I returned to Germany when I again worked at a nuclear research lab. But then another 2 years later, I attended an international conference in Paris. Here was Professor Parkinson from the University of Michigan, my mentor, who had invited me earlier. And he asked me, "You never responded to our letter." I said, "What letter? I have not received any letter." Well, they had made me an offer for a faculty position. The rest is history. So I joined the faculty of the university, the physics faculty of the University of Michigan in 1965. I came with my family, with my wife and 2 children. And then I retired 33 years later, in 1998. I was teaching, of course, for many years. I was in charge of the advanced intermediate labs, undergraduate labs. So this was the modern physics labs, the nuclear physics labs, the atomic physics labs, and optics. So in the modern physics lab, for example, the students measure the speed of light with a pulsed laser beam, which they sent down the hallway, was reflected, and then they measured the difference between the outgoing and the returning light flash, typically 150 nanoseconds. Most of my research career, which I started then, which I continued then, was in experimental nuclear physics with particle accelerators, primarily with cyclotrons. In the early years, we worked on the nuclear shell model, which only a few years earlier had been discovered incidentally with a Nobel Prize to Maria Goeppert-Meyer from Chicago and Professor Jensen from Heidelberg, who was also on my thesis committee. Initially, this work was done on North Campus, at the cyclotron lab on North Campus. Professor Parkinson, I mentioned him, was the director of this lab. Then later on, a colleague of mine and I, we had a joint National Science Foundation grant, and we worked at many accelerator labs in the United States, from Brookhaven National Lab, Long Island, to the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, to the Cyclotron Institute at Texas A&M University, to the Arbor National Lab, to the superconducting cyclotron lab at MS, and several others. Then we were a small group. We were a small group. There was a postdoc, graduate students, and undergraduate students. And then later in the 1980s and 1990s, I started working overseas. In the 1980s, I spent 2 sabbaticals, full years, in the Netherlands at the KVE, one of the 2 national labs in the Netherlands, in the north of the Netherlands. And in the 1990s, I worked long times, months on end, in Japan at the Research Center for Nuclear Physics. My first visit was on the invitation of JSPS, the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, which is essentially the equivalent of the National Science Foundation. And my last visit was supported by Osaka University. So the Research Center for Nuclear Physics was at Osaka University, and it attracted many people to go there because they had some new interesting equipment. So the purpose of these experiments were, of course, nuclear structure and related things. So in Japan, we worked on giant resonances. 1, 2, 3. We were larger groups because the Japanese and the Dutch groups had many students, which had one advantage, that the more senior people were not signed up for night shifts anymore when we ran the experiment. I also did theoretical work, often alone, sometimes with 1 or 2 collaborators, even undergraduate students, and some of these undergraduates are very bright. There's one work I will mention later. This was a collaboration with a famous Russian physicist, the director of an institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. I'll come to this back later. Over the years, I attended many international conferences in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in Russia, and in Japan. I'm proud that very early in my career, in 1967, so this was 2 years after I had returned here, I was invited to give a lecture at a conference in Winnipeg. I had just before written a theoretical paper on vector and tensor Coulomb energies, whatever that is, vector and tensor Coulomb energies. This triggered the invitation. I gave my presentation, and a famous attendant of the conference, maybe the most important person in the conference, fell asleep in the first row. That's what I remember. He had jet lag, of course. He came from Germany. These conferences are, of course, important for the exchange of scientific ideas, but you also meet people. So it was at this conference in Winnipeg that I met Nissan Zeldes from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem for the first time, not knowing that this would become a lifelong friendship. He came for 2 sabbaticals in Arbor. We met in Jerusalem for a full week. Lifelong friendships. I was invited for 2 conferences in Russia. I arrived in Moscow. I was very apprehensive by myself. I was very apprehensive, hoping someone would greet me. Indeed, there was someone with a sign, Dubna. The conference was in Dubna, which is about 100 miles north of Moscow on the Volga River. It is a huge research complex, the Joint Institute of Nuclear Research. So they had invited me I talked about charge exchange reactions. It is the Joint Institute of Nuclear Research is the Eastern equivalent to what CERN in Geneva is for the West. At a conference in Niigata, that's a funny story. At a conference in Niigata in 1994, I was privileged to chair the last session of the conference. At the last session, you have to say some nice words to the organizers, how good a job they did, etc., etc. I decided to do this in Japanese. Now, I'm not fluent in Japanese, but anyway, I managed to construct my sentences. I had them corrected by colleagues of mine. I memorized it, and it came off very well. This, incidentally, is also the conference where there are some things which were done at these conferences. They start Sunday evening, and then in midweek there is a joint outing for all the conference participants, on the order of 100. We went to a Buddhist temple, and then we went to a sake factory with free sake. It became a very happy affair. Sake in Niigata is among the best ones because that's where the best rice grows. But let me finish with a little more interesting conference. After my retirement in 2001, I attended a conference in Finland, in Hämeenlinna, the birthplace of Sibelius. I decided to insert a 10-minute section into an afternoon session where I talked about a famous Russian physicist who had died a year earlier. Professor Goldansky was the director of an Institute of Chemical Physics of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. He had many honors, Lenin Prize, he was fellow of the American Physical Society, Pugwash. He was also for 1 year under Gorbachev in the Soviet parliament. Goldansky and I had some earlier contact, some interaction, because of some joint, this was in the 70s, I believe, because of some joint interest in some new radioactive decay mode. I met him 3 times personally. The first time, he called me from Willow Run Airport in the 70s when he attended a conference at Wayne State University. Then I met him at a conference in Germany. And then the third time was 1998 at La Jolla. La Jolla, it was a small gathering organized by Elsevier, this big Dutch publishing house for scientific and medical research. He asked me whether I was interested to collaborate with him on a project he had started with a student. Well, I agreed. So for 2 years, we collaborated long distance between Moscow and in Arbor. When 2 years later, so we did this with email, which was very difficult at the time still, and snail mail, so we also exchanged letters. So 2 years later, there came a letter from him, which he signed affectionately. Somehow it didn't make sense to me. A director of an institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences doesn't sign a letter to me with affectionately. Then I found out that he was ill and he died shortly thereafter. I interpret this, it was his way of saying goodbye. We have 3 joint publications. I, of course, added his name with an asterisk, deceased. Well, let me come closer to an end. I loved my work in nuclear physics. I really loved it. Both the experimental work and the theoretical work. I visit many interesting places, both doing experiments and during these conferences. I met many interesting people. One interesting event, which I remember, was a banquet in Paris on top of the Eiffel Tower, on the intermediate level. This was 1975, the 100-year anniversary of the Meter Convention, 1875, which the United States never signed. let me finish with a slightly different subject. For many years, I was involved writing on a book project, which is gradually, for many, many years, it is gradually coming to an end, maybe later this year or early last year. My 3 brothers wrote many letters home, and my mother, of course, wrote very, very many letters to her sons. She collected all these letters, and then over many years, I transcribed all these handwritten letters from the old Gothic scripts, which is called Citylene, into the computer. Then, several years ago, 6 or 7, a niece of mine living in Switzerland told me, why don't you have this published? Okay, so I went ahead to get it into a format which could be published. And then it was about 2 or 3 years ago when I talked with a colleague of mine. He said, why don't you have it translated into English? So I was thinking about it. I was in contact with a professor in the Germanic languages department, and he said, well, let me ask my best student. And what a student he had. Stephanie, she was a remarkable student. She was a remarkable student. The translating was a multi-step process. I mean, she did, of course, 90 or 95% of all the work. I started out with Google Translate, handed it to her together with the German text, and then in sections over a full year, she translated everything. Then she didn't hand it back to me. She handed it back to her professor, who made some corrections. He then handed it to me. I made corrections. I handed it back to Andrew, and then it came back to me. She made it. She wrote a preface, which is also included in the book. She wrote a preface, and let me quickly read a short segment of what Stephanie wrote. When I was approached by a client seeking to have a set of letters translated from German to English, I was not expecting the exciting, emotional, and educational journey that lay ahead. Tragically, all 3 brothers were killed in action during the war. The letters they wrote are a treasure and a time capsule, preserving their expectation, their experience, and personalities in their writings. It was an honor and a privilege. Thank you very much.